My name is Rosalind Pemberton. I'm 31 years old, and I hold the rank of captain in the British Army. But on my wedding day, in front of 280 guests, CEOs, military brass, and the entire board of Pemberton Industries, my father did something that would fracture his world in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. He slapped me at the altar. The sound detonated through Westminster Cathedral like a gunshot, silencing the organ's trembling final note. I felt the impact register in my body with the precision of tactical training. My head turning with the force, my mind separating from my flesh the way soldiers are taught to do. But what came next was worse than any physical blow. He leaned close, his breath reeking of expensive scotch, and whispered words meant only for me. "You've embarrassed me for the last time. You are no daughter of mine." That's when everything changed. Before we jump into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from right now and what time it is there for you. Take a second and drop it in the comments. All right, let's get into it. The thing about my father, Edward Pemberton, was that he kept meticulous records. He didn't just run a construction empire from our London headquarters. He documented everything. Every achievement, every failure, every person's worth reduced to numbers in a leather-bound ledger, and I learned my value when I was 19 years old. It was Christmas dinner, 1988, our family tradition. After the table had been cleared and the coffee poured, my father would retreat to his study and return with the book. Dark green leather, gold lettering, ancient-looking. He called it the Pemberton Ledger. It was sacred in our household. He'd start with my older brother, James. "Exceptional year," he'd announce, his voice booming with pride. The logistics pro contract. Net gain of $2 million for the company. The scratch of his fountain pen on paper. Applause. My father beaming at him like he'd personally moved mountains, then William. The Manchester residential project. Excellent management. 800,000 in value. My brothers basked in it. That warm glow of being quantified, measured, and found profitable. The year I was 19, I'd won first place at the National Science Fair. Structural engineering analysis, a new methodology for testing composite building materials. I was bursting with pride. I stood up to present my work to the table. I explained the methodology. I talked about the applications. I finished, nervous, desperate. My father opened the ledger. His pen moved to the final column, the one that mattered. He wrote a number, a large, bold, unmistakable number. He looked at me over his glasses. "If it doesn't sell, it has no value," he said coldly. An important lesson, Rosalind. The humiliation was physical. It hollowed me out. That night, my mother came to my room. Margaret never offered comfort in traditional ways. She sat on the edge of my bed and told me something I'd never known. Before she married Edward, she'd owned a small flower shop in Bristol. It was hers. She loved it. When they got engaged, Edward had convinced her to sell it. The real reason, she said, was that he couldn't bear her owning something he didn't control. She took my hand. "Don't let him buy your soul, Rosalind," she whispered. Her eyes fierce with a sadness that cut deeper than any blade. "It's worth more than all the numbers in that book." She died 4 years later. Cancer, relentless as my father's need for dominance. But she left me with her inheritance, that quiet act of resistance. My brothers, however, had inherited Edward's cruelty. They enforced his worldview enthusiastically. When I announced my decision to enlist in the British Army at 22, it was James who sealed my fate. "Just let her go, Dad," I overheard him say. "She's a lost cause anyway. At least the army will teach her to follow an order." I was a failed investment, so I made my break clean. I refused the trust fund. I walked away from Pemberton Industries with nothing but a duffel bag and a burning need to prove that my mother's faith in me was worth infinitely more than zero. The price was steep. My first posting was at Aldershot Garrison, Hampshire. I found a cramped flat near the base, the rent cheap for brutal reasons. The heating was ancient. That first winter, it failed completely. I didn't have the money for repairs, so I slept in fleece and layers, my breath visible in the freezing dark. But it didn't break me. It forged me. That forging was personified by Sergeant Major Hayes, a career NCO with 20 years in the infantry, and a face carved by experience. He read my file. He saw Pemberton and the dollar signs attached. He made it his personal mission to discover if the privileged daughter would last. He assigned me the toughest tasks, the longest ruck marches, the most complex navigation courses. During a 36-hour field exercise with minimal food and water, I felt my legs start to give. Exhaustion was a physical weight. My vision blurred. Haze appeared over me like a shadow. He didn't offer water or a hand up. He simply looked at me with absolute clarity. "Pain is temporary, Captain," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But honor is forever." He wasn't tormenting me. He was teaching me that my last name meant nothing out here. My father's ledger had no value. The only currency was grit. I pushed myself up and kept moving. I passed his test. After my first deployment to Basra, Iraq, I was promoted to lieutenant. I'd led soldiers in a combat zone and brought them home. In naive hope, I wrote a letter to my father. Not to gloat, I wanted to explain my world. I filled 4 pages about my soldiers, the weight of command, what it meant to build a legacy of people, not buildings. I sent it to Pemberton Industries headquarters. 2 weeks later, a crisp envelope arrived in Baghdad. Inside was my own letter, torn into 4 neat squares. A message without words. He hadn't just rejected my words. He'd negated my entire existence. That was the last time I ever sought his approval. In Helmand Province, Afghanistan, everything changed. My patrol came under coordinated fire from mud brick compounds, RPGs, machine gun fire, chaos. A 19-year-old private took shrapnel in his leg, exposed in the kill zone. Without thought, I moved. I laid down covering fire and dragged him to the armored vehicle yard by Painful Yard. When the firefight ended, he grabbed my hand. His face was pale, but his eyes were clear. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. "I will follow you anywhere." In that moment, I understood everything. My father built skyscrapers, monuments to commerce, impressive. Hollow. I was building something infinitely more valuable: loyalty, trust, bonds forged in dust and blood. It was in the Tactical Operations Center at RF Kandahar that I met Mark Ashford. The room smelled of dust, stale coffee, and jet fuel. I was briefing senior officers on an upcoming mission, specifically warning about a flaw in satellite imagery that suggested a planned route was actually a complex ambush setup. I laid out the evidence: suspicious shadows, recent heat signatures. A full colonel dismissed me immediately. "You're being overly cautious, Captain." I felt that familiar sting of being brushed aside. Then a voice cut through the murmuring. "I'll take thin." Every head turned. Standing near the back was a captain I didn't recognize. Tall, lean, marked by the quiet intensity of special forces. He was the leader of the Ranger team in question. "I trust Captain Pemberton's assessment," he said calmly. "My team doesn't move until we verify." He had just publicly contradicted a colonel and held up his mission, based on my word alone. A stranger's judgment about lives. He wasn't sizing me up as a woman. He was respecting me as a professional. In that moment, he signed a contract with me. One written in trust, not ink. Our first date was in the dining facility under fluorescent lights and mediocre food. He didn't ask about my family or my father's business. He asked, "What's the hardest command decision you've ever made?" I told him about Iraq, about abandoning expensive surveillance equipment to evacuate a wounded soldier. It had earned me a reprimand for the loss of government property. He listened, his eyes never leaving mine. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "You chose people over gear," he said. "That's the mark of a good leader." No one had ever called me that before. In my family, choosing people over assets was a sign of poor investment. With one sentence, Mark had taken what my father saw as weakness and reframed it as strength. When we returned to the United Kingdom, he took me hiking in the Cotswolds. On a rocky outcrop overlooking the river in golden afternoon light, he pulled 2 blank military dog tags from his pocket. Simple, silver, heavy. "On these, they stamp your name. Blood type, religion," he said. "What the military needs to identify your body. But I want to know what you stand for." He handed me one of the blank tags. "What will you etch onto your life, Rosalind?" It wasn't a proposal, it was something deeper. An invitation to build a shared legacy. A contract based on values, not assets. "Honor," I said. "Loyalty," he replied. Before we made it official, I had to take him to meet my father. We met for lunch at an upscale London restaurant. Edward sized Mark up like a business acquisition, asking about his salary, his prospects, his family's net worth. When he learned Mark was career military, Edward smirked. "I suppose it's good my daughter found someone who shares her hobby of playing war," he said dismissively. "When you're ready to build something real, come see me." Mark didn't flinch. He met my father's gaze with absolute calm. "We're already building something, sir," he replied. "A life." My father was speechless. On the drive home, I was quiet. The encounter had left a sour taste. Mark reached over and placed an old brass compass in my palm. It was worn smooth from use. "I was going to give you this later," he said. "But you need it now. You always know the way home, no matter where home is. He paused, his eyes seeing through every defense I'd built. You don't need his empire, Rosalind, he said firmly. You are an empire. The weeks before the wedding were strange. For the first time, I felt like I was building a life on my own terms, my own empire. But old worlds don't surrender without a fight. 2 weeks before the wedding, my oldest brother James called. His voice was honey laced with arsenic, sickeningly sweet, entirely fake. Rosalind, sweetheart, he began, the picture of concern. Dad just wants what's best for you. He picked out a dress, Alexander McQueen, absolutely stunning. As a wedding gift, he set aside a substantial check. Just think of it as a business transaction. There it was, my identity, my dignity, my self-respect, all commodities to be traded. My wedding is not a business deal, James, I said coldly, and I'm not for sale. I hung up before he could respond. The next day, a text arrived. A photograph of my mother smiling, her arm around young me. The caption read, "She would have wanted this." They were using her memory as a weapon. Then the package came. An enormous box bearing the elegant Alexander McQueen script. It wasn't a gift, it was a power move. My father declaring that my wishes were irrelevant. Inside was a gown of breathtaking beauty. Ivory silk, intricate lace, the kind of dress little girls dream of. But I didn't see a dream, I saw a prison, a uniform of surrender. I looked at my own uniform hanging crisp and proud on my bedroom door. My dress blues, the polished brass buttons, the rows of ribbons telling the story of my life, my sacrifices, my honor. One was a costume, the other was my skin. The next morning, I repacked the gown carefully. No ripping, no defacing. This was a strategic operation, not an emotional one. I drove it to a small charity called Armed Services Brides UK. They provide wedding dresses free to military women who can't afford them. I carried the box inside and placed it on the counter. I'd like to donate this, I said simply, anonymously. The woman was speechless. Before I left, I placed a small note card on top of the box. I'd written it the night before with absolute clarity. For a woman who understands that strength is more beautiful than silk. As I walked into the sunshine, I felt a weight lift. I hadn't just gotten rid of a dress. I had taken a symbol of my father's oppression and transformed it into a gift of solidarity. The night before the wedding, there was no bachelorette party. My real family gathered around a crackling bonfire in the backyard of our rented house. My 2 Ranger escorts, a tough female Apache pilot I'd served with in Iraq, others from my tight-knit community. We passed around bottles of Guinness and told old stories. We laughed in the language of soldiers. That particular way of building solidarity without saying the words. When the last of them had left, their tail lights disappearing into the darkness. Mark and I stood by the dying embers. He pulled out an old brass military compass, worn smooth from decades of use. This was my grandfather's, he said, placing it in my hand. It got him through Normandy. I'm not giving it to you because I think you'll get lost. I'm giving it because even when you can't see a foot in front of your face, you will always know your true north. Later that night, long after Mark had fallen asleep, I sat in our living room and retrieved a small wooden box from my closet. The only thing I'd taken from my childhood home. My mother's keepsakes. Inside, beneath a pressed flower and faded photographs, was her last letter. She'd written it a month before she died, her handwriting shaky but clear. I found the final lines I was searching for, a Bible verse. Joshua 1:9. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you, wherever you go. A profound sense of peace settled over me. My mother had been fighting this quiet war her entire life. She had been preparing me for this moment all along. I wasn't just a daughter rebelling against her father. I was a soldier carrying on the legacy of a fallen comrade. The next morning, I woke before dawn and began the ritual of preparation I knew intimately. I fastened each button on my dress uniform with precision. I straightened the jacket. Then came the medals. The Army Commendation Medal, the Iraq Campaign Medal, the Afghanistan Campaign Medal, and finally the Military Cross, my father's silly pieces of metal. To me, they were entries in my own ledger, records of loyalty, sacrifice, and courage. I placed the old compass on my dresser next to a small framed photograph of my mother. When I stood before the full-length mirror, I didn't see a bride. I saw Captain Rosalind Pemberton, fully prepared, her armor in place, ready for the most important mission of her life. The moment the heavy oak doors of Westminster Cathedral swung open, a hushed silence fell over the pews. Then I saw him, My father stood at the center of the aisle, directly in my path, not waiting to give me away, waiting to stop me. A human wall between me and my future. For a split second, the conditioned reflex of a lifetime took over. Fear, sharp and cold. My shoulders tensed. My breath caught, but then I felt it. Imperceptible pressure on either side. My escort's two hardened rangers had imperceptibly squared their shoulders. A signal, a silent, steadying pressure that communicated everything without words. "We are here. We have your back." That was all I needed. I took the first step. Each step down that aisle was a journey through my private war zone. I could see the Pemberton dining room, the leather-bound ledger, my father's pen writing that damning 0. I could feel the humiliation burning. I could see the mailroom in Baghdad, the envelope from Pemberton Industries, my own letter torn into neat squares. My heart, my pride, my soul, rejected without a word. Then my father began to speak. His voice boomed through the cathedral with the measured cadence of a CEO delivering a final verdict. He spoke of shame, of disrespect, of family honor. He meant corporate reputation. For a terrifying moment, I felt myself shrinking. The captain began to fade. The little girl desperate for approval began to surface. I felt weak, exposed, my armor of metal and rank suddenly as flimsy as paper. And then another voice cut through the chaos in my mind. It was quiet, gravelly, and steady. The voice I'd first heard during a 36-hour training exercise. The voice that had pulled me back from collapse. "Pain is temporary, Captain, but honor is forever." Sergeant Major Hayes' words. A shield. Simple, hard and true. Forged in a crucible my father could never comprehend. That voice was louder than my father's roar. I refused to look at his raised hand. I refused to give it power. Instead, I fixed my gaze past my father, down the aisle to Mark. He was standing perfectly still at the altar, his hands clasped behind his back. On his face there was no pity, no fear, no urge to rush forward and save me. Only absolute, unwavering trust. He wasn't looking at a victim. He was looking at his partner, his equal, and he was trusting me to handle my sector of the battle. In that infinite decimal space between a hand being raised and a blow being struck, I realized this was a choice. A final, definitive choice laid bare before God and 280 witnesses. Who was I going to be in the instant after this moment passed? A commander never flinches. A commander holds the line. I straightened my back. I lifted my chin. I braced for the impact. The slap cracked through the cathedral. But Mark moved first, silent, lethal, efficient. He didn't touch my father. He didn't need to. He simply stepped between us, his body a solid, immovable barrier. He looked my father directly in the eye, and that simple act of defiance held more menace than any shouted threat. Then he turned his head slightly toward me, his voice cutting through the suffocating tension loud enough for the front rows to hear clearly. "Captain, do you require medical assistance?" My father, enraged at being thwarted, opened his mouth to roar. But Mark raised a hand, a gesture of absolute authority that stopped him cold. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mark announced to the stunned cathedral, his voice the crisp, precise tone of an officer reporting an incident. "Please remain calm. An assault on a commissioned officer of the British Army has just occurred. Please remain in your seats." The air went electric. But the real coup came from a place my father could never have anticipated. From the third pew, an elderly man with a chest full of ribbons and 4 silver stars rose to his feet. General Davies, a living legend. Mark's mentor. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice, a deep and powerful baritone honed by decades of command, rolled through Westminster like thunder. Attention, it was the highest command. It was not a request. It was an order ingrained in every soldier's DNA. The response was instantaneous. Throughout the cathedral, a sound like a single sharp crack echoed off the stone walls. It was the sound of dozens of pairs of heels snapping together in perfect synchronized unison. Every service member in the room, young rangers, seasoned colonels, decorated generals, quiet veterans scattered among the pews, rose as one. They didn't just stand up. Their backs went ramrod straight, their chins went up, their eyes locked forward. They formed a living, breathing wall of honor. A silent, magnificent barrier that surrounded and shielded me. They did not look at my father. They looked straight ahead, their collective gaze fixed on some distant point of duty. It was the most profound act of condemnation I had ever witnessed. A dismissal so complete, so absolute, it was more terrifying than any accusation. They had erased him from the battlefield in a single unified motion. My father stood stunned into silence, his face contorted with rage moments before, was now a mask of utter disbelief. The power dynamic had shifted violently, giving him whiplash. He looked around desperately, searching for his own army. He turned to his CEOs, his politicians, his board members, men he'd invited to witness his power. But they were looking at him with the cold, calculating eyes of risk assessors. They understood the unspoken laws of power. You must always remain in control. Richard Pemberton had just committed the ultimate sin. He had lost control in the most public way imaginable. He had attacked a symbol, a uniformed officer, a decorated soldier that even they knew they were supposed to respect. He was no longer a powerful patriarch. He was a liability, a volatile asset, a bad investment. His judgment was silent, but it was final. He was alone, utterly and completely alone. He looked at his sons, but they wouldn't meet his eyes. They stared intently at their polished shoes, fascinatingly absorbed by the Persian rug beneath their feet, wishing they could dissolve into the floor. Edward Pemberton, the titan of industry, took an involuntary step back. He stumbled slightly on the altar step, a perfect metaphor for his collapse. No one spoke. The organ was silent. The only sound was the low hum of the air conditioning, a sound that now seemed to roar in the deafening silence. He turned, his shoulders slumped. He walked back down the aisle with the shuffling gait of a defeated man being expelled from the field of battle. His retreat was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, pathetic, soul-crushing. A surrender filled with silence more damning than any scream. I watched him go, and for the first time in my life, I felt nothing for him. Not anger, not pity, not sadness, nothing. I turned my gaze forward to Mark and did not look back. A profound silence settled over Westminster. But this was different. Not the dead shock of before. This was a silence of reverence, of awe. I took the first truly steady breath I'd taken since the doors opened and walked the final steps to the altar where Mark was waiting. He took my hand. His grip was warm and solid. Together we turned to face Father Coleman, an elderly man with kind eyes that had seen a lifetime of human joy and sorrow. He didn't immediately return to the liturgy. He stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the assembled guests with gentle wisdom. "In our lives," he began, his voice calm and clear, resonating with quiet authority that commanded more attention than my father's roars ever could. "We are all called to fight battles. Some are fought in distant lands in the dust and heat of conflict. And some," he paused, his eyes finding mine with profound respect, "are fought right here in the sanctuary of our own hearts. Today we have been witnesses to great courage. Now let us celebrate the love that courage protects." He had reframed everything. He didn't dismiss the ugliness that had just occurred. He sanctified my struggle. He took what my father had intended as a family scandal and elevated it into a testament of strength. He gave my battle honor. As we turned to face each other to say our vows, every word took on new profound weight. When I looked at Mark and spoke the ancient words to have and to hold, to love and to cherish, I wasn't just speaking to him. I was making a promise to myself, a vow to cherish the woman I'd fought so hard to become. And when Mark spoke his vows, his voice steady and sure as he promised to honor and protect me, every person in that cathedral knew it wasn't just lines from a script. It was a solemn oath he had already proven through action. Our vows weren't just spoken. They were ratified. The reception was held in a beautiful old London ballroom with high ceilings and crystal chandeliers. My brothers hovered awkwardly in a far corner, nursing expensive scotch, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Finally, James approached me, his tie loosened, his arrogance replaced by nervous energy. "Well, you've really made a mess of things, Rosalind," he muttered, not meeting my eye. "Pemberton Industries stock is probably going to take a hit on Monday. Dad's reputation is everything." I looked at him, his perfectly tailored suit, his worried expression that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with money, and I felt nothing. The anger was gone. The hurt was gone. All that was left was hollow, echoing pity. He was a prince of an empire I no longer had any allegiance to, speaking a language of profit and loss that was now foreign to me. "That's your empire, James," I said softly. "Not mine." I turned my back and walked away. Later, as the band played, Mark approached the band leader and whispered something. The band leader's eyebrows shot up in surprise, but he nodded. The opening chords that rang out were not a gentle waltz. It was the raw, defiant guitar riff of Creedence Clearwater Revival's Fortunate Son, an anti-war anthem beloved by soldiers for its unvarnished truth about class and privilege. Our song, our friends understood instantly. They formed a circle around us, not as spectators, but as participants. They were surrounding two of their own. We danced in the middle of that circle of honor, laughing, liberated, and free. It wasn't the first dance of newlyweds. It was the victory dance of survivors, of soldiers who had won their war and finally come home. That night, after the last guests had departed, Mark and I stood on a small balcony overlooking the glittering lights of London. The air was cool and clean. He came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist, his chin resting gently on my shoulder. We stood in comfortable silence for a long time, just breathing together. "Does it hurt?" he asked softly. My hand went to my cheek, to the place where the slap had landed. I felt the smooth, unbroken skin. Then my hand moved down, resting over my heart. I thought of 30 years of slights, of dismissals, of being told my worth was zero. I felt the steady, calm rhythm beneath my palm. "Not anymore," I whispered, and I meant it for both places. A few months later, a large framed photograph arrived at our home. Inside was a picture taken from the church balcony, a wide shot capturing the exact moment the soldiers had risen to their feet. Perfect rigid lines of uniformed officers, their backs straight, their gazes fixed forward. In the center was me, a lone figure in dress blues, shielded and protected by this silent, magnificent wall of honor. Off to the side, almost an afterthought, was the blurred figure of my father, isolated and irrelevant. My eyes welled with tears. Our friends had secretly arranged for a wedding photographer to capture that moment. Bolted to the bottom of the rich, dark wood frame was a simple polished brass plaque. The engraving was elegant and clear. Family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the people who stand up with you. We hung it in the center of our living room, our first and only family portrait. It was perfect, a year later, on the anniversary of my mother's passing. I drove to the cemetery where she was buried. The sun was warm. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of old oak trees. I sat down on the grass beside her headstone and pulled a letter from my bag. "Hi, Mom," I began, my voice clear and steady. "It's me. A lot has happened this year. I wanted to let you know. I finally did it. I built my own legacy. It's not made of brick and mortar. It's not measured in square feet or stock prices. It's built on a foundation of honor. It's held together by the mortar of loyalty. And it's sheltered by a love so strong it can face down any storm. It's smaller than Dad's empire, but it's real and it's mine. You told me not to let him buy my soul. I didn't. I held on to what was true, even when no one was clapping. I hope you're proud." I folded the letter. I didn't need an answer. I could feel it. A few years later, now a major in the army, I was asked to speak to a group of newly commissioned female officers. Young women about to take on their first leadership roles. They sat before me, their faces young, eager, full of confidence and fear. I looked out at those bright, determined faces, the future leaders of our military, and left them with the most important intelligence I have ever gathered. "People will try to tell you what you are worth," I said, my voice ringing with conviction forged in fire. "They will put a price tag on your dreams. They will try to fit you into a column on their ledger. Do not ever believe them. Your value, your legacy, is not defined by their applause. It is defined by your actions when no one is watching. It's defined by the integrity you maintain when you are tested. And it is defined by how you stand your ground when the entire world is telling you to fall back. So go out there and build your own empire." That's my story. Proof that a legacy isn't something you inherit. It's something you build one act of courage at a time. If you've felt the weight of someone else's judgment, if you've fought to define your own worth, please subscribe to Hidden Family Infidelity and Revenge. Like this story if it touched you. And comment below with one word that defines the empire you are building.